to all the mothers in our congregation. Few weeks ago, I got the message that I was preaching on Mother's Day instead of 5th Sabbath of April, which is usually when Youth Sabbath School takes up worship. My response was, yeah, great, I'll do it. As I was thinking about writing a sermon, I realized that it would be more appropriate for a mother to preach on Mother's Day. Like, why am I here on this podium? Ain't it supposed to be a mother to share their life stories or share their words? Anyway, since I am preaching, I reasoned as a son how much I appreciate my mother, and what a great opportunity to show my gratitude to my mother and God by preaching on this day. Since my senior year in high school back in 2013, I haven't done any public speaking, and this is my first time ever preaching. As I can tell, my hands are sweaty right now, but I got this. Sorry. Might be inappropriate to say that word. So please be patient with me and pray that God will lead me. We all agree that mother's love for her child is extraordinary. Most children would testify that they are what they are because of their parents, especially their mothers. As we are celebrating Mother's Sabbath, I want to focus on mothers. First, I ask myself, who are the mothers of great biblical characters such as Moses, Samuel, David, Solomon, and Jesus? What roles did their mothers play in their lives? As I was researching on this topic, I realized how ordinary all these women were, and yet how crucial their role was in the lives of their children. For today's sermon, I will focus on Moses' mother, Jochebed. Before I get into details, let me refresh the story found in Exodus chapter 1 and 2. In the story of Exodus chapter 1 and 2, the Egyptians were fearful of increasing Israelite population, so they decreed to destroy every newborn son by throwing them into waters of River Nile. Jochebed gave birth to Moses and sees him as a goodly child. Jochebed hides Moses for 3 months in her home, disobeying the Egyptian decree. Knowing she can't maintain this deception forever, she weaves a reed basket and coats it with tar. She puts Moses in the basket and places the basket near the edge of the Nile, close to the reeds. Moses' older sister, Miriam, watches from a distance to see what would happen. Pharaoh's daughter is bathing in Nile and sees the basket and has one of her maids fetch it. When she opens the basket, Moses is crying, and even though she recognizes him as Hebrew, she has compassion because, after all, she is a mother. Miriam runs to her, offering to find a Hebrew woman to nurse the baby. The princess agrees, and Miriam gets Jochebed. Pharaoh's daughter pays Jochebed to nurse Moses. When old enough, Moses is delivered to Pharaoh's daughter, and he becomes her son. She gave him the name Moses, which means draw out. Let's get into details now. Number 1, you don't have to be extraordinary mother to raise an extraordinary child. Jochebed is like any other Hebrew woman. Her child is like any other Hebrew male child destined to be killed. Unlike Mary, the mother of Jesus, Jochebed didn't communicate with an angel. There is no indication that God said anything to her audibly throughout this whole experience. However, she did it anyway despite the odds stacking up against her. Number 2, God uses a mother's instinct and common sense to reveal his will. Even though government dictated it, or few in the society are doing it, Jochebed willingly couldn't throw her son into Nile to be destroyed. Her natural instincts were God's voice motivating her to take action. Common sense made it clear that she could effectively hide Moses in the house for only a short period of time. Instead of waiting for the inevitable, she formulated a plan. God spoke through common sense. She used a 3-month Moses was kept in the house to pray and plan before acting. She couldn't afford to wait forever, but she couldn't afford to act too soon either. Number 3, a mother's practical skills and life experience are enough to carry out God's plan. Bible didn't tell us where or how Jochebed learned to build a basket out of reeds, but it was obviously a skill she knew. We aren't told how she learned to make it water, but maybe because she lived close to the river. It isn't strange that this skill was also understood. The important thing is she drew from her experience and used the skill she had to accomplish the desired end. She did what she was able to do and didn't try going beyond her practical abilities. Very much like David using a sling instead of Saul's armor. Using her practical skill and experience, she did her best and left rest to God. Number 4, she used every disadvantage to her advantage. For a Hebrew mother, the sight of Nile is terrifying because every boy was ordered to be thrown into these waters. On the contrary, the Egyptians worshipped the Nile. It was like a god to them. Jochebed would have known the superstition and wasn't afraid to use it to good advantage. Finding a boy floating in the Nile would be seen as a good omen by any Egyptian, especially the daughter of Pharaoh. Reading between the lines, we could understand that she somehow knew bathing practices of Pharaoh's daughter. She could have strategically placed Moses near the edge of the Nile, close to the reeds, where Pharaoh's daughter would be bathing. There is a good chance that Pharaoh's daughter would reject Moses and let him die. But she bet on the women's natural brooding tendencies to put Moses in a very special light in the eyes of Pharaoh's daughter. She also strategically placed Miriam in the vicinity and would have trained her when and what to speak. And sure enough, Moses was afforded nothing but the best treatment, even though a Hebrew. God's voice encouraged her to make good use of the circumstances into her advantage. Number 5, Jochebed understood God's promises to Abraham and acted upon them. God had previously spoken to Abraham and made predictions and promises about his descendants. Those promises are, they would be strangers in the land that is not theirs, obviously Egypt. They would be slaves to this nation and would be afflicted by them. They would be without a homeland for 400 years, beginning with Abraham. God would bring judgment on this nation, and they would be delivered from slavery and leave the nation with great wealth. Jochebed would have been familiar with these promises, and though spoken several hundred years before, they still reverberated in her heart. She also knew the timeline. Her generation was close to the point of deliverance, and there was no reason to believe God wouldn't begin raising up a leader to facilitate these promises during her life. It would be fanciful to suggest Jochebed knew Moses was God's chosen leader for Israel as soon as he was born. She loved her son like any mother would love a son, and began doing what any mother would do to save him one step at a time. But as things developed, she began putting two and two together. The extraordinary way in which things were happening suggested God was interested in more than just the survival of one Hebrew infant. She began visualizing the salvation of an entire nation. An audible voice wasn't needed to suggest it. The facts were obvious. Number 6, knowing that she would have to give up Moses, she made him aware of the God's promises of deliverance. No doubt Moses learned about God's promises to Abraham and Israel from Jochebed, and she more than likely suggested to Moses that God had chosen him to deliver Israel, hence his ill-conceived attempt at relieving their bondage by killing an Egyptian slave driver. Unfortunately, Moses didn't learn the practicalities of discerning God's will from his mother. We have to assume Moses continued to have contact with Jochebed and his siblings throughout his youth, since he had no problem recognizing his brother Aaron when he returned to Egypt from Midian. Jochebed made sure Moses knew his life's purpose, which later helped him make the biggest decision of his life, that is to abandon luxuries of Egypt and bear the burdens of his people. Number 7, courage to follow through God's plan. Using the little information she had, along the basic human nature and experience, Jochebed was able to follow God's leadership through some very dangerous situations. The main point here is that many would have known God's plan, but she had the courage to follow through it. That is why we are talking about her today. In the conclusion, dear mothers, I want you to take the inspiration from the life of Jochebed and know that you are well equipped to carry our God's plan. Number 1, everything might be working against you, but you don't give up like Jochebed. Number 2, you might not have enough time to spend with your child, but make it count like Jochebed, and God will make sure to bring fruits. Number 3, you might not have any control over a situation like the way Jochebed had to give up her child to Pharaoh's daughter. Don't despair. God is in control, so trust him. Number 4, when Moses had to flee to Midian and be in exile for 40 years, Jochebed might have thought that all she had toiled for years is a waste. Don't be in despair if you are in that situation. God will bring your son back and will fulfill his purpose. Number 5, you might be underappreciated, but know this: Bible didn't forget Jochebed. All your sacrifices are noted by God, and He makes a pretty good account of them. Know that God and many of us appreciate what you do for all of us. And number 6, finally, know that God can't raise great spiritual gifts like Moses, Miriam, and many more without you. You are much bigger than what you think you are. Thank you for having me here. May God bless you. Happy Sabbath and happy Mother's Day to all in our congregation.